Hello and welcome to GMI, Guitar and Music Institute. This episode features the second part of the Hummie Mann interview. Hummie talks about his work in Berklee, some of the incredible musicians he met and studied with. As well as this, he talks about his time after Berklee, the various jobs he got working all over Canada and into the United States, and ultimately this episode ends with his moving to LA. If you're listening to this podcast on iTunes, please visit www.guitarandmusicinstitute.com for further downloads, videos and supplementary materials to this podcast. If you are listening on iTunes or any of our other outlets, please subscribe. Love to have you as part of our family. So coming up is the second part of the Hummie Mann interview. I hope you enjoy it. What happened then, Hummie? I mean, that sounds a real hard, old school way of learning your trade or your craft.
Yeah. So I got through Berklee. It was a great school. I was very fortunate that at the time, like I said, the graduating class was so small that my classes were very tiny, and I got to work with some great, talented people. The other thing that I got to do when I was at Berklee that was really amazing is that because I was Canadian, I could only work in the States on campus. And I somehow managed to get the job of being in charge of the concerts. I worked for the guy who was in charge of the concerts and visiting lectures and stuff. So I got to meet Charles Mingus and Clark Terry. I mean, it was just a who's who of like great musicians that I actually got to escort and personally meet. One of the great stories about that is one year, so that was part of the job, but the other part of the job is that everybody who had to do a recital, which was all the performance majors, I would get them the list of who they were playing with and what their set list was going to be. I would take that up to the printing office. They would print out, it wasn't really programs, they were more like 8.5 by 11 posters, and then I'd have to post these posters all over the school. And then I'd have to be at the recital, turn on the lights, turn on the PA system, help them get set up. And I remember one time going to a recital, and the place was like, there wasn't a huge recital hall, but the place was like packed. And I didn't have any clue what was going on because for some reason I was unaware that this was happening. Turns out that there was somebody who was doing his senior recital who got fellow student Pat Metheny to be a sideman. And everybody came to see Pat. And this guy, you can just imagine, the saxophone player was doing his senior recital, and everybody just wanted to hear Pat play. And Pat Metheny showed up at Berklee when I was there as a student, and then the next semester was a teacher.
I was going to ask if I had an inkling that Pat and you had been there at the same time. There as a student, he's then there as a teacher.
Yeah, but that happened a number of times when I was at Berklee. There were a couple of people who came to Berklee and just were so amazingly gifted that it was obvious that there was nothing that they just woodshed like crazy. And Pat's one of those.
Did you get to meet him?
Possibly, but I don't remember because it didn't make a mark on me. I mean, he probably came in and set up while I was helping set up the stage, but that's about all. And I think that was in my senior year, and I was really kind of focused on getting my portfolio completed and writing all these big band charts and all that stuff. So I was, I didn't have a whole lot of socializing time. There was a lot of time that I had to spend by myself writing music. My portfolio was like 300 pages thick of orchestral works and piano pieces and choral works and fugues, and I mean the requirements to graduate Berklee when I was there were pretty significant.
You are listening to GMI, the Guitar and Music Institute. My name is Jed Berklee, and I'm in conversation with composer Hummie Mann. Hummie, it's always difficult for students to move from education into gainful employment, especially within the creative industries and especially within music. How did it work for you?
Well, I knew I was going to be, basically when I graduated, I moved to Toronto because at that point that was kind of the music center of Canada. Possibly still is, although there are other pretty pretty significant centers, Vancouver, Montreal. I was from Montreal, but I wanted to be in Toronto because at that point, that in my mind was where television production, film production was going on. I moved there and I started thinking that I wanted to do film music. And one of the things that was attracting me to film music was the idea that I was going to get to write a lot of different kinds of music. That's one of the things that I really appreciated about being at Berklee, is that I was doing jazz and I was in a rock ensemble and I was doing this rip off of the Paul Winter Consort, and I was playing in the concert band because I was an oboe player, and I was writing big band charts for so it really, I mean, and that, being quite honest with you, that had always been the case, even prior to going to Berklee. I mean, I was teaching myself piano and playing in kind of a jazz rock band and playing guitar, doing folk and folk rock concerts. I mean, the variety of different writing and different music. And by the way, I was writing for all of these things. That really was what attracted me.
You're totally submerged in music at this point.
Yeah, totally, pretty much. So I got to Toronto, got lucky that there was a school that was starting called the Toronto New School of Music. And it was basically an instrumental school where they had a lot of private lessons. And I walked in and I don't even remember how I found the place. I mean, it's totally, that memory's completely gone. But what I did know, they didn't have a theory, composition, ear training instructor. And so I said, great, I'll do that. And so I started doing all of the composition, theory, and ear training private lessons. And on top of that, we formed a school big band, which was the first big band that I had. And I was doing all the writing and leading the band, and the band was made up of faculty and students. And we would get together once or twice a week and do rehearsals of all my music. It was great. So I had an outlet that I was writing for and that I was doing, and then I was leading. And then that was like one day a week I was teaching. You know, there wasn't that much teaching work to do. And somehow one of the musicians that I met at the school said, well, you know, the biggest booking agency in town is Bud Matton. And Bud Matton Agency was like, you know, an agency that was booking, you know, bands into clubs, basically. And at the time that I got to Toronto, there was a thing going on in a lot of the clubs in Canada, and possibly in the States too, where they did what were called show bands, which means that the band would not only play like dance music, but they would do a show set. It was kind of like a small Vegas show. And Bud Matton, who is a very smart man and himself a pretty talented musician, I think he was a sax player actually, yeah. He brought me in. I went to his place, and I didn't even know what I was going to be doing. You know, I had no clue. I went to his office. I made an appointment with him, and he said, "So you're from Berklee College of Music?" And you know, of course, some people wear that as a badge of courage, but it's also sometimes, you know, if the player isn't a good player,
you're waiting to get shot down.
Right, exactly, absolutely. And so there was some skepticism about what that meant. You know, I was very proud of the fact that I was from Berklee, but I was also, I came to know that also could be not a good thing. So anyway, I go in and I meet with Bud Matton, and he says, well, there's a band downstairs in the basement auditioning. You go audition them. I'd never auditioned a band. I had no idea what I was doing. So I go down into the basement. They sing three songs, and I go upstairs. I say, well, you know, they didn't really know the chord changes of the tunes properly, and they kind of were singing flat, and their time wasn't all that great, which is all the stuff he expected from a guy from Berklee. But then for some reason, and I don't even know why I said it, I said, but the worst thing is that they're just standing still like a bunch of stiffs up there. You know, no one's going to ever want to watch it. And Bud turns around and he says to me, "You're hired." And I said,
that was the one thing. He's showbiz, man.
That was the one thing. He said, you know, I've interviewed a bunch of Berklee guys, and nobody has ever caught the fact that they have to be performers. It's not just about being musicians.
Isn't it amazing how, well, not exactly careers, but so much can just fall or one way or the other on just something like that?
It was unbelievable, and it was at a time where Bud Matton was trying to go from being a booking agent into a manager. And by being a manager, he could charge a larger percentage of you know, commission from his bands, but he had to give them services. Well, what were the services? The services were, you know, you get more personal attention from the agents. Okay, big deal. You'd get to play the better rooms, which is obviously a big deal. But then the thing that he did is he said, we're going to have a music director in the agency, and these guys will get to work with you. So here I am, fresh out of Berklee College of Music. I'm given a company car. I'm given an expense account, and I'm now on salary, And what I have to do is I have to go and listen to bands, make notes about their performances, both about how they're doing the things, and then, how they're performing, they're playing the right chords, if they're playing flat, if they're playing, all the other musical stuff. And then I got to put shows together. So if somebody said we want to do, I'll never forget, there was this band that came from the Philippines. So these young kids from the Philippines, and Bud said, I want them to do a big band medley. And I went, big band medley? They don't play any brass instruments. He says, you got to teach them. And so I learned, like, what is a string of pearls? Ba 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 da ba 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 da ba ba. It's 5 notes, and the trombone part is ba 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 ba. It's like the silliest thing in the world. So I was teaching these Filipino rock musicians how to play trumpet and trombone.
Talk about landing on your feet. That sounds amazing.
And then it turns out that all of the bands that were management bands got to go to Florida during going to the southern United States, to resort hotels in southern United States during the winter, when it was horrible to work up in Toronto. So Bud was flying me down to resort hotels in Florida, where basically I'd have to watch the band during their show, during their act at night. During the day, I would do some arranging. And then after hours, we would get together rehearsals, and I would teach them new pieces. So if they wanted to do like a platters medley, I'd do the transcription and teach them the parts. Most of these guys couldn't read music. So I would be basically teaching them the parts. We'd run the thing over and over and over again. And I'd get to spend a week in Florida. And then to add to the beauty of this thing, I had met my future wife, who was working at Berklee. She was the woman who was printing up the posters, Vicky. So you've met Vicky. She was printing up the posters that I was having to go put up on the elevators and the pinup boards to advertise the different performances and recitals. So I'm flying to Florida, and Bud would let me stop in Boston and go visit Vicky. So I'd leave. I'd fly to Boston. I'd spend 2 days in Boston with Vicky. I'd fly down to Florida for 2 weeks, spend 2 weeks in the sun, all expenses paid at resort hotels, getting my salary, and basically, getting at least 5 or 6 hours a day, free time to just hang out in the sun, go swimming, whatever I wanted to do, hang out with the band when they were socializing.
How did you manage to keep up this hectic schedule?
It was like I died and gone to heaven. The only problem was that the whole thing kind of came crashing down when Bud decided that he was going to retire, and he wanted his son to take over the business, who was not a musician, was not a real good Purple person. I mean, we just didn't get along, to be quite honest with you. And then at one point, Bud was wanted me to train him to learn how to put together sets and stuff like that, and it started becoming like a power struggle between me and this guy who I didn't really have any respect for, because he didn't have any background in music except for being Bud's son. So basically, it was between me and Bud's son, and he of course he picked his son. At that point, I left the position of being the musical director for the agency and joined one of the acts that was part of the agency. And it was I forget the name of the act, but it was like a 9-piece band we had like brass players and stuff. And our show that we were going to do was the entire rock opera of Tommy. And so we rehearsed this for like 2 or 3 weeks, and then went to a club and did, we had to also do, Brick House and various, dance tones. But our show was the rock opera Tommy. We did the entire rock opera. It was a big deal. Nobody was traveling around doing the entire rock opera of Tommy. We had, trombone players so we could do the French horn parts, and it was amazing. I wasn't the lead singer, but I was the acoustic guitar player. We had an electric guitar player and a bass player and a keyboard player, and a number of the guys doubled on trumpet and trombone, and we had a full-time sax player. It was like 9 guys. Anyway, I remember we went out of town to do our first week of performing, and got standing ovations at the end of every Tommy performance. And so we knew we were onto something. It was in the middle of winter. We're driving home Saturday night. You pack up and drive back. One of these young kids fell asleep at the wheel of the equipment truck. Luckily, he wasn't killed. But the equipment truck flipped, destroyed all of our gear, and ended the band. So after, we were on, and Bud had booked us into all of these great hotels because of the response to the Tommy thing, and he was advertising it as like, come in here, Tommy done live, and we only got to do it for 1 week. Gee. And then the band broke up, and the next thing that happened was that I joined this country band that had a lead singer named Linda, and the drummer in the band was her husband, and her husband kind of had a problem with rushing. So you'd start a piece that you picked a fine time to leave me, Lucille, and by the time you were at the end, 4,000, and just like going. This guy like would take, rushing, for those who are not musicians, rushing means getting faster and faster, not in a good way.
Yeah, I've played with drummers like that.
Right, we've all played. There's all the musicians, and again, for those non-musicians, it's like when people talk about drummers that have good time, it's like part of the element is that they don't change tempo unless they're supposed to. Yeah. So anyway, we're playing mining towns in northern Ontario.
Was it stuff like Mozart and Beethoven?
Yeah, sure. It was more like Mama, don't let your babies grow up to be cowboys, and Lucille, and we'd sing stuff by the Oak Ridge Boys, and I'm trying to remember what the other I forget all the country singers' names that we would do, but it was completely country, and we were playing in these clubs that were not the classiest places. I mean, in some cases, when we hit to the very northern end of Ontario, we're playing mining towns, we would come on like 45 minutes after the stripper acts would end. So, there'd be a bunch of inebriated miners sitting around, and when Linda would come on, they didn't realize that the strippers had stopped and the band had started, and they go, "Hey, take it off, honey!"
They'd be delighted to see you guys.
Yeah, right, exactly. It's like, oh, now we're going for culture, and I'll never forget how this happened, but this is a true story. One night, somebody came up on the drum stand on the stand when we were doing, I guess it was a version of some song that Frank had a drum solo, and this inebriated customer held the beer bottle by the neck with the body sticking out and held it up to Frank. And Frank went around the drum set and hit it all the tom-toms, boop, 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 and then whack, hits the beer bottle. And the glass was flying everywhere. And me and the keyboard player, it was basically me on guitar and a guy named Neil Chambers, who unfortunately passed away a number of years ago. And Neil was playing keyboards with one hand and left-hand bass, on a special keyboard that sounded like a bass.
Yeah.
And it was just a trio with Linda. And anyway, so Neil and I are looking at each other and going, what the heck just happened? The next thing we know, everybody in the bar is standing in line with their beer bottles. And Frank's doing this extended drum solo, boop, 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 whack, and glass is flying all over the place. The stage was completely littered with glass, which made the strippers very unhappy because the next day they would get up on stage and there's glass all over the floor where they're doing their gyrations. It was just a nightmare. It felt like it was out of the Blues Brothers before the Blues Brothers happened. It was kind of like, oh my God, what's going on?
How did you feel your career was going at this point, Hummie?
Ugh, I was like, it was depressing. It was totally depressing. And
in a way, though, do you feel that the problems you had with the son of the club owner or whatever was a good thing in a sense because it was maybe too comfy that?
Yeah, I think the thing is that I was not getting to pursue my dream, which is really I wanted to be a writer. And so I was on the road with Linda Lane for a while, and then I got hired. I got asked to join a comedy team, a Canadian comedy team, as their musical director.
How did that come about?
Well, they were also represented by Bud Matton, but they wanted to play bigger clubs. And in order to play bigger clubs, it couldn't just be a duo. They needed like a backup band. And so they talked to me, and I had actually done work with them when I was working for Bud Matton. I was doing arrangements for them because one guy, they would perform with two matching grand pianos up on stage that had been gutted, and inside one was a Fender Rhodes, and inside the other was a Hammond B3 organ. And so they would do like piano and organ stuff. They were good. They were good for their audience. Most of the stuff they did was comedy, but then they played like one or two serious songs. And so what ended up happening is that I knew that my days with Linda's band were numbered, so I could survive playing the northern mining towns of Ontario. And again, the people were wonderful. It's just that, we just played kind of these really rough and tumble places and rough and tumble bars.
They sound very much reminiscent of some areas of Scotland, to be honest.
Oh, I'm sure, there's people that's their lifestyle is very different than mine, and going out and, getting slogged on a Friday night is that's what they do, and it's not the way I work. But, I would say that during that period of my life, I saw some of the most amazing bar fights I'd ever seen in my life. There were more than once that I had to leave the stage because people were throwing beer bottles at me, because they didn't like.
You were protected by a steel cage or something in one.
No, I think the thing was that we all saw that in the Blues Brothers movie. I never actually played in a club like that, but I think that there were two times in my life where beer bottles were thrown at me. One was playing with this band because we were playing right after the strippers, and the clients of the club wanted more flesh than they wanted country music, and so they throw beer bottles at you to try to get you off the stage and get the strippers back. And then the other time was when I was playing with the comedy team, and we were playing at the Calgary Stampede. I just had to get off stage so my guitar wouldn't get smashed.
What is the Calgary Stampede? Okay,
well, let me get into that. So basically what ended up happening is after playing with this country band, I joined this comedy team as their musical director, and we added a trio that would travel with them. So we had a bass player, a drummer, and myself, and we all played multiple instruments. So the drummer played vibes, and the bass player played electric and acoustic bass, and I was playing some keyboards, some guitar, keyboards, flute, and oboe, and also the drummer also played flute.
How's your oboe at this point, Hummie?
Rusty, but fine for inebriated characters who are coming to see a comedy team. So, I wasn't going to be joining any symphony anytime soon. That was for sure. But at that point, I still wanted to keep it up because I, learned how to play oboe and I didn't want to lose it. What happened is that the comedy team we did an opening number that was kind of a Vegas opening number, and the band would start, and then these guys would come on and sing a song that was kind of in retrospect, a pretty not something I'm particularly proud of, but I did a bossa nova version of "Send in the Clowns," and that's what they came on to, and then it was a medley with that and a piece called "Love 'Em, Love It." There's a band from Hawaii called Kalapana, and we played one of their songs, and it was a kind of a medley. So it started with "Send in the Clouds" and ended with Kalapana. Anyway, and then what these comedians would do is they would take a handheld light, which they used to call the equalizer, and they'd go around the audience and interview people, and then shtick. Where are you from? Oh, I'm from such and such a city. Oh, we'd break into a song, or they, and sometimes it was a little bit kind of insulting. It was. And so they go around the room, and if you were from a certain city, they make fun of the city. Or if you were a certain profession, they make fun of the profession. And sometimes it was done with music, and sometimes it was done just with comedy. And then other things that be part of the show is we do a Barry Manilow medley, and things of that sort. It's pretty middle of the road type of stuff, but very popular. The Calgary Stampede happens once a year, and it's basically a cowboy tournament where they do what's it called when they ride on the back of
the rodeos.
Rodeo, yeah, exactly. It's all rodeo events. So we play the Calgary Stampede, which is basically the biggest rodeo event in Canada. It's once a year, and cowboys come from all over the United States and Canada to participate because the purses, if you win an event, are very big, but the entrance fees are pretty big. So one night we're up on stage and we're performing at a big, huge club. It's like 2,000 person club in the Calgary at the Calgary Stampede at night, and all the rodeo events are over. And of course, these guys are going around with their equalizer light, and they find this cowboy who's got his like silver collar tabs, and he's wearing a fancy cowboy hat, and he's pretty drunk. Turns out that he, came from some city far away with his horse, and he got eliminated in the first round, and he's just basically drinking his sorrows away. Well, of course, perfect target for comedy, right? So they start picking on this guy, and of course he starts throwing beer bottles, and then other people start throwing beer bottles, and then the drunk guy leaves, And luckily, the bouncers at the front door were pretty sharp because they caught him coming back with a gun. So it's at that point that I probably started reassessing my career. No, but being honest, what happened in terms of getting to Los Angeles and how I ended up where I am was that while we were on tour with Matton and Hamilton, and I did the longest road tour I've ever done. I did like a year road tour where I was actually on the road for a year. In fact, I got married in Toronto. My first anniversary, I was in Vancouver, and my wife was in Toronto. And I said, well, this isn't going to work. And I wasn't getting to do what I wanted to do anyway. I had started writing big band charts and orchestral charts for them to do their show in Vegas, because we actually played some of the rooms in Vegas, not the main rooms, but the small lounges. And they did quite well because it works for that audience. But they really wanted to be playing main rooms, where really the big dollars are, and, you could hire a whole orchestra. And I had an interest in that. But when that obviously didn't happen, I wanted to get out. I didn't want to continue doing this. The idea of playing Calgary Stampede again was not very exciting to me. And even though we were playing nice clubs in Florida and all this other stuff, I didn't want to be doing that. While we were on tour, we spent a couple weeks in Los Angeles, where we had an agent down in Los Angeles, and we four-walled one of the comedy clubs down there. I forget which one. So four-walling it means that we basically take over the club, and it's by invitation only, and they invited a lot of agents to come. And so we were trying to get them well known in the States, and with the hopes that somebody would take them on to kind of get them up to the next level of their career. And while I was there, a friend of a friend had been hired to write a song, to do a commercial for the American Cancer Society. And this woman instead wrote an entire song. She was also a Canadian person who was down in the States trying to make her way. Somehow I got connected to her, and I went in and took this 3-minute song and reduced it down to a 30-second commercial and produced a commercial that ended up being the most played public service spot during the heyday of Saturday Night Live. Wow. So on Saturday Night Live, I'd be watching Saturday Night Live with Chevy Chase and the original cast and John Belushi, and my commercial would come on. And so what ended up happening was that with the strength of that, the person who produced that spot, who'd actually hired this woman, was primarily a Spanish language advertising producer. And so what was happening is that I would be on the road with this comedy act. I'd fly to Los Angeles on the weekend, produce a commercial. And my brother-in-law used to love making fun of me because I would do Spanish language. I didn't even understand the language, but, calidad no es sorpresa at Crossroads Chevrolet. So I'd be doing the Crossroads Chevrolet spots and the Bank of Mexico spots. And once I had my toenail in the door in Los Angeles, that's when I finally gave my resignation to the comedy team after being on the road for a year and a bit with them. Vicky, my then wife, who was finishing her degree at, and who is still my wife, by the way, in Toronto, she graduated from Ryerson Polytechnic Institute. We put everything we owned into a truck and drove to Los Angeles and started my career down there.
In the third part of the Hummie Mann interview, Hummie talks about his time in LA, working with Mel Brooks and Mark Shaman, and how he really managed to, as well as becoming not only an orchestrator but a composer within the Hollywood scene. So make sure you tune in and subscribe for that episode. If you do enjoy the GMI podcasts, please consider supporting us through our Patreon page. A link is given underneath this episode on the GMI webpage. Thanks for listening, and see you on the next one.